All right, today we have the honor of having Dr. David Schoenfeld with us. Dr. Schoenfeld is a developmental behavioral pediatrician and a professor of clinical pediatrics at Keck School of Medicine at USC, and a renowned expert on grief and grief recovery. We have the opportunity to hear from him today. He's going to be talking to us about talking with your children about grief and loss. So I want to pass it off to Dr. Schoenfeld, and welcome.
All right, well, thank you very much. And as Eric mentioned, we're going to be working with Walton Public Schools over the next couple of years, thanks to some funding from the Brave of Heart Fund. So you will be hearing more from me and my colleagues. So today I'm going to be talking about how do you talk with your children about grief and loss. And so I want to start by acknowledging that even prior to this pandemic, loss was very common in the lives of children in the United States. About 5% of children experience the death of a parent by 16 years of age, and about 9 out of 10 experience the death of a family member or friend by the time they complete high school. And that was prior to the pandemic. Although most children will adjust even major loss, it doesn't mean they don't grieve, and it certainly doesn't mean that grieving isn't extremely difficult for them. But the reality is that many children may not share their grief, even with their parents and other caregivers, and they may not appear to be grieving at any particular time. Well, there are a number of reasons for that. One is that adults may unintentionally communicate to children that death is something you just don't openly discuss. If you think about it, if a young child asks a parent, let's say one parent has died, and the child talks to the surviving parent and says things like, "I know daddy's dead, but is he going to be here on my birthday?" Then usually the surviving parent responds by crying. And that can lead particularly young children to think that they caused their parent to cry by somehow misbehaving. So many children will then quickly turn around and say things like, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of everything. We're going to be okay. I know how to fix things in the house, and I can make dinner. I'll do everything Daddy used to do." They may even attempt to support the parent who's actively grieving and give the parent the false impression that the child has somehow adjusted to their loss or isn't grieving significantly. And that's one of the benefits why we would like children to be able to talk to someone outside the family, such as within the school, so that the children don't have to worry about protecting the person they're talking to. But there are other reasons why children may not appear to be grieving. Very young children or children with intellectual disabilities, for example, may not yet understand what's happened, or young children may not understand fully its implications. When somebody dies, you lose the person, and we call that in the field the primary loss. But you also have a wide range of secondary losses. Everything the person did, could have done for you, or might have done for you in the future is also part of that loss when the individual dies. And kids may not realize that or think about all those potential losses in the future when they first find out about a death. I remember talking to a dad who said to me, now that his wife had died in a car accident and left him with 2 young children, he said, "I live in dread of the day my daughter's going to have her first period. Her mother should be there for her." The issue was the girl was only about 5 years old at the time, and I don't think that was something she was even considering. But it will be something that she may recognize when she reaches the appropriate age. So children tend to grow into their grief as they start to understand what the loss actually means for them and for their family. But children may actually understand what's happened and understand the implications, but they should then just feel too overwhelmed by their feelings to even talk about it. Children may also express their grief indirectly through their behavior or try to work their feelings out through play. There are many games that children play where death is a central theme. There's one game we've probably all played with children at the same developmental level that really is one of the first games about death. When children are first born, we say they don't have object permanence. So when something's out of sight, it's literally out of mind, say with a 3-month-old or a 4-month-old. So they really can't grieve because they don't have kind of an internal representation of people to be able to remember that they're missing when they're not in sight. But once children start to develop object permanence, which begins about 6 to 9 months of age, they start to have the capacity to recognize that people are gone, that they care a great deal about. And that's when kids start to play the same game, the same developmental period in every culture in the world. Here in the United States, we call it peekaboo. It starts somewhere about 6 to 9 months of age as children are starting to develop object permanence. And in the game, the child fixes their gaze on someone. Then there's separation as if they've died. The child shows heightened concern and awareness, and the joy at reunion. And then they want to play it again and again and again. You always have to ask yourself, why do children want to play a game which I think is pretty boring and repetitive? Why do they feel a need to keep doing it? And the reason is because they're trying to learn what death means. In fact, peekaboo, for those who don't know Middle English, it translates literally, peekaboo is alive or dead. And that's what the game is about. And now that we're approaching the end of October, we have a custom in our country that we dress children up, typically like individuals who have died or might kill someone. They go to strangers' porches, they shout out dead, and they get non-nutritive reinforcers in the form of candy in a bag. It's an odd tradition, and it's really just one of many ways that kids start to talk about and play around themes related to death. Now, the other reason that you may not notice that children are grieving is because they don't sustain strong emotions such as grief for a long period of time. They actually don't really sustain strong emotions of any type for a long period of time. So they may grieve, be sad, and then quickly return to play or another activity, giving the impression somehow that they're over their sadness, but maybe they just can't sustain it for a long period of time. And children, adolescents, and even adults may understand what's going on, may feel capable of expressing it, but still choose to keep their losses private and not discuss their feelings with other adults, whether that be their parents or educators or other school professionals, because grief in many ways is a personal experience. Now, the kids may not want to talk about it, but the adults usually don't want to talk about it either. Many adults think they don't know what to say to make things better, and they're often afraid they're just going to say the wrong thing and make matters worse. And so you get this expression, if I don't know what to say, it's better to say nothing. But I will say that saying nothing to a grieving child communicates a lot. It communicates that adults are either unconcerned, uncaring, unable, or worst of all, unwilling to be of assistance. Those aren't messages we want children to receive when they are grieving. And it just leaves children confused and unsupported, and it requires them to grieve alone. So let me go over some of the things you might think about reconsidering when you're talking with a grieving child, whether it's your own child or whether it's another child that you're helping to support. Because a lot of times people tell me they're afraid to say the wrong thing. So let me go over some of the things that may be wrong to say. First thing is you don't want to try and encourage the child to cheer up or to look happy. I know people will often say things like, I know it hurts very much right now, but I'm sure you're going to feel better in a short period of time. You should allow them to experience their grief and not try and tell them they should accelerate the process or try and look happy. You also don't want to encourage them to be strong or to cover up their emotions. I always tell people that anything that begins with at least is probably something you should reconsider. Like at least he's not in pain anymore, or your mother may have died, but at least you still have your father. I think witnesses just do that because they don't like to see children grieving, and they want to feel like they can make it better when they really can't. So what you want to do is allow children to experience their grief, express it directly, and take as long as they need to be able to deal with their own grief. You should feel free to express your own feelings and demonstrate empathy, but don't state you know exactly how other people feel. So comments such as, I realize this must be extremely difficult for you, or I can only imagine what this is like for you and your family, I think are good ways to demonstrate empathy. But I would avoid making statements such as, I know exactly what you're going through, when you haven't even asked them. You first have to ask them, what are you going through? Tell me, describe it for me. You would want to avoid things like, you must be angry. Let the individual express their own feelings and don't tell them how they ought to feel. You may also wish to limit the sharing of your own personal losses and keep the focus on the child's experience and feelings. Now, if this is your own child that's grieving, that's very appropriate for you to share some of your grief experience if it's someone that you know in common, like a family member. And that way you can share with them how you feel and ask them how they feel. But you still want to make sure that the primary focus is on the child and the child's needs. One of the common experiences that I did want to highlight is the reaction related to guilt. Children tend to focus on themselves and view themselves as the center of the universe. And they often have a very limited understanding of why things actually occur. And as a result, they often rely on what we call magical thinking, believing that unrelated actions, thoughts, or wishes may cause important events in their world. And magical thinking is often reinforced by parents. Parents wish their children to believe that if they eat their vegetables at dinner, then somebody called Santa Claus, who they maybe never have met, will somehow be aware that this has occurred and will bring them a present that they want at Christmas time without you even telling them. If you do raise your children to believe that, and I should say, my family is Catholic, and I raised my children to believe in Santa Claus when they were young. It's not a problem with it. But if that does occur, then you shouldn't be surprised when children conclude that someone died because they had done or only thought something bad. I remember talking to a second grade boy. His brother had died of sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, or what some people call crib death. And what had happened was that his mother was a school psychologist and had explained very carefully what had happened to the extent they knew. The father was also very supportive. They each worked in one of the medical schools in the city. And they were really very caring, open parents with the child. He was very bright and precocious. And I remember on the first visit, he looked at me and he said, my mother's going to have another child. And I said, yeah, she looks like she's about to have a baby. And I asked him, what do you think about that? And he said, I think my mother's trying to replace my brother who died. And I asked him, can you do that? And he said, of course you can't do that. But that's what I think she thinks. So here was a kid who had insight to what his parents might have been motivated for doing. He talked about his feelings and how they had all improved. He wasn't having any behavioral difficulties or any problems. He was very open and interested in coming to the visits just to talk. So at the end of the second visit, I'd shown him a film strip on feelings that children have when someone dies. He said he enjoyed it, but that he had some of those feelings for the first week or so, but they've actually all been improved. So then I just looked at him and I said, so why did your brother die? And he looked at me and he just said, because I went to camp that day. So even though he had been given great explanations and he had gotten some counseling, he still felt guilty because the bottom line is SIDS death of unknown cause. So he really didn't understand why. And when we don't understand why, we often take responsibility. In fact, guilt continues to be an extremely common reaction that you'll see in adolescents as well as adults. When someone we care about dies and we don't understand it, then we wonder and worry, will someone else I care about die? And if you think you don't have any control over it, it means you don't have any control over it happening again. So sometimes people, at least at an unconscious level, will accept responsibility for something they did, didn't do, or should have done, rather than to feel that it is outside of their control. And therefore, if it was outside of their control, it probably still is outside their control. So people sometimes will accept this illusion of control, which brings with it a sense of guilt. The problem is it's just an illusion of control, so it doesn't really work at preventing future deaths, and it leaves the individual with guilt that's very hard to manage. So I think it's important to reassure children and adults of their absence of responsibility after death of someone close to them, even if there doesn't seem to you to be a logical reason why they may actually feel guilty. I remember going to speak to a class of 3rd and 4th grade children, and I went over this and the guilt, and I said, when something bad happens, we feel badly. And when we feel badly, we often assume that we did something bad. But thoughts and feelings don't cause people to die, even though a lot of kids tell me that they thought it might. And I remember one girl wrote a note to me that all the students were asked to write a note to me for coming and speak with them. And in her note, she just said, "Dear Dr. Schoenfeld, thank you for coming to our class and talking about what happens when someone dies. Now I know it's not my fault. My father killed himself." And then she just wrote, "Have a happy Valentine's Day," and signed her name. Now, I'm not suggesting that my comment was enough to deal with all the guilt feelings she had about her father's death, but it actually was enough for her to start to talk about it. And that's really what we want to encourage. I will say I have found the same thing with adults. when I go over with them about their child's death, often I reassure them of their lack of responsibility. And that's when they start to tell me about what they did, didn't do, should have done, that they thought might have contributed to their child's death. So it's very common. I think Calvin was very smart about this. He calls for his mom and he says, a big dog knocked me down and he stole Hobbs. And he said, I tried to get him. I tried to catch him, but I couldn't. And now I've lost his best friend. And his mother just says, well, Calvin, if you wouldn't drag that tiger everywhere, things like this wouldn't happen. And he points out there's no problem so awful. You can't add some guilt to it and make it even worse. So please look for that guilt and reassure children, each other, among the adults, and yourself about your lack of responsibility. The next thing I wanted to go over was really how children may misunderstand what we tell them. And I'm going to talk about misconceptions and literal misinterpretations. For young children, their thought processes are very concrete and often quite literal. So you might give them an explanation and they may just misunderstand that explanation. And as a result, a good explanation may still lead to a lack of understanding. So here's another example from Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin asks if the milk is spoiled and his mom says, smell it and see. And he says, I'm not going to smell it, you smell it. Without asking what he's concerned about, she simply says, oh, for goodness sake, here it's fine. And then he explains after she's already left, I don't take chances with a product that prints the date she might expire. So you may not really know how children are misunderstanding what you say to them. So you should be careful about explanations. It's not uncommon for children to be told after someone has died that there's going to be an open casket. People say, well, it's a box and the body is placed there. But for some children, they'll then say, well, I don't want to look in. And people just assume that they are afraid to see a body of someone who has died. But for some individuals, some children, if you say the body is in the casket, they may assume that the head is placed somewhere else. And that's why they don't want to look in. So even children who are bright, giving good explanations, can still get off a little bit in terms of their understanding. I remember when I was a young child, I asked my dad what funeral homes were. And we had just passed a funeral home and I read the sign. And my dad said, well, funeral homes are like large homes where they place people after they've died, just as they were when they were alive. And people come and visit them to spend time with them so that they feel more comfortable seeing them as they were when they were alive. And so then I remember asking him, well, what happens when they run out of space? And he just said, well, they're actually very large and they have a lot of extra rooms. So he didn't ask any further what I meant by that, but I had been to a wax museum. And when he said that they placed people as they were when they were alive and people came and visited to spend time with them, I had assumed it was like a wax museum where there would be somebody doing dishes and someone else sitting and reading a book. And I just didn't understand like what happens when you fill up all of the rooms. Because he never told me, he didn't say in that explanation that they actually bury them afterwards. And I did not take that for granted. And so kids can just get, misunderstandings based on literal misinterpretations. I also remember taking care of a patient many years ago. He was about 11 years old and he had sickle cell disease. He was having these dizzy spells that we thought might be small strokes that can occur with sickle cell disease. And it's very dangerous and can cause strokes in the brain. So he was admitted in the hospital and was waiting for further workup. And at that time, children stayed in the hospital longer and we actually talked to them more. So at about, I think it was about the 5th day of his admission, I remember just talking with him, just sitting and talking with him. And he looked at me and he said, I'm the oldest. And I said, the oldest what? And he said, I'm the oldest kid with sickle cell. And I just looked at him, I said, do you mean in the world? And he goes, no, I don't know about the world, but I'm the oldest child with sickle cell in the sickle cell clinic at the hospital. And I looked at him, I said, well, what do you think happens when you get older? And he said, I suppose you die. So I said, well, you're 11 And actually, right now, we transfer children to the adult sickle cell program in the other hospital across the street when they turn 12. I said, so you're not going to actually die. You're just going to walk across the street to the other hospital. And I remember he looked at me and he said, are you kidding me? And I go, no, I'm not kidding you. So with the patient's permission, I introduced him to a 17-year-old who had sickle cell disease, who was also getting care on the same ward. And they sat and they talked together. I don't know exactly what they discussed, but he walked out of the meeting and he turned to me and he said, I feel better now. I'm ready to go home. So just because he had this misconception, he was terrified that he was going to drop dead at any point. And that was why he was having the dizzy spells. So you just need to realize that if children react in a way that's different than what you expect, or they don't want to talk about it, or they seem to have more distress than you would imagine, make sure that they really understand what's going on. So we want to give children developmentally appropriate explanations and then ask them what they understand of it. And then as they explain it back to the adults, then sometimes the misconceptions and misunderstandings and limited information can become more apparent and then can be corrected. I think it's also useful, particularly when you're dealing with younger children, to understand a little bit about the concepts of death that children need to understand in order to cope with the death. So there are 4 basic concepts about death that people must understand before they can fully grasp and then cope with the death. The first is irreversibility. They need to appreciate that death is irreversible. When somebody dies, they don't come back to life again. And sometimes in television shows and in movies, that is not the case. Characters may die, but be back for the next episode, particularly in cartoons. And so you want to make sure that they understand that death is irreversible, because if they don't, there's really no reason to grieve. Might as well just wait for them to come back. And a lot of times people will tell me, well, understanding that death is irreversible is very advanced and young children won't be able to understand that. And that's not true. I remember telling my own child when she was about 21 months old about the death of a family member. And at the time, she didn't know what the word dead meant because she wasn't yet 2. And so I tried different explanations. And finally, I came up with that the person was all gone. And she looked at me and just said, all gone? And I said, yes. And she walked over and got a baby book out of a bag, turned it to the page where the toddler holds the cereal bowl upside down and says, all gone. She turned to that page, sent the person's name, and then asked, all gone. And I said, yes. And she never asked to see that person again. So kids can understand this concept at a very young age. Now, it may be hard for them to accept, but it's hard for adults to accept. But it is not a very advanced concept for them to at least understand. So the next one has been called finality or non-functionality, just an appreciation that all life functions end completely at the time of death. Young children may realize that when someone dies, they can't move anymore, but think because the coffin constrains them. Or they may think the person can't see because it's dark underground. But if you take a picture that the child has drawn and ask permission to place it in the casket with a close family member, children may often assume that that person can actually see it, because otherwise, really, why would you do it? And if they can see the picture, it means they can see that they're in the middle of the casket and be aware that they're being buried. So children will often have preoccupation with physical suffering of someone who's died. So you want to make sure they understand that the body doesn't work anymore. The person doesn't breathe, doesn't feel pain, isn't hungry, etc., just so that they aren't preoccupied with the physical suffering of deceased. When I did my first presentation to kids about this, I talked to 3 children whose parent had died, and they were all due to natural causes and unrelated to each other. And all 3 of the children were still having recurrent nightmares of the person digging themselves out of the grave. It's just a common fear. It's the basis of a lot of movies geared to children that you'll see around this time of year in particular, around zombies and vampires and living dead. They're all trying to figure out what are the limits to life and what does it mean when someone has died. And those films are created to frighten children because they are learning these concepts. The next concept's been called inevitability or universality. This is just an appreciation that everything that's alive eventually dies. If children don't appreciate that everyone is going to die, and you somehow reassure them that you'll always be there for them, for example. Then when someone does die, they have to figure out, why was that person selected? They usually come up with two reasons. One is that the child did something so horrible that God has punished them by killing someone that they love. And then they're ashamed of the death and don't want to talk about it. Or they may think that the person did something that was so horrible that they've been punished by being killed, in which case then they will be ashamed of the death and not want to talk about it. And in both cases, they just don't want to talk about it. But we need them to understand that every living thing eventually dies. And then go to the last concept, which is causality. What are the true physical reasons why someone dies? And if they know that, they're less likely to come up with explanations that lead to guilt and shame. Now, most children understand these concepts by somewhere around age 5 to 7, but even children who are much younger can understand these concepts. And I've worked with children that are 2 or less that have. And with education and explanation, we can advance significantly the rate at which they learn these concepts. Now, religious concepts can be shared with children, but they should not be relied upon as the sole explanation of death, because they tend to be more abstract. And attempts to place religious concepts in more concrete terms are usually ineffective, and they provide little understanding of both the physical reality and the spiritual beliefs. I remember seeing one boy, he came in for stomach aches to a walk-in clinic. His brother had died of SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome, maybe about 4 to 6 months beforehand. And the parents did not think he was having any trouble with adjusting to this death. But as I asked more questions about his behavior, the mother finally said, well, he does actually misbehave in church now. We didn't notice, I didn't make the association, but now that you mention it. So I asked, what was the reason you told him his brother died? I just said, we told him he was such a good little baby that God wanted him back at his side as an angel. And I said, what did you tell him church is? And they said, well, church is God's home. I said, maybe when he goes over to God's house, he wants to make it quite clear he's not of angel potential and doesn't want to be called back to the other side. And they just looked at me and they said, did we actually do that? Like, is that why he's acting that way? And all I could imagine was every Sunday he woke up and his parents told him that if he didn't behave, they were going to kill him. And he just thought if he did behave, that he would be struck dead by God. And he spent all of Mass proving that he wasn't good enough. And so obviously that explanation didn't explain things to him well, and just left him with more fear and distress than actual comfort. Now, I've been talking about really developmental age and not chronologic age. So children with intellectual and neurodevelopmental disabilities like autism spectrum disorder may face unique challenges in the aftermath of the death of someone they love. Children who cannot communicate well often express their distress in nonverbal ways, such as becoming more aggressive or showing disruptive behavior. Some children may increase self-stimulating behaviors, and they may rock, chew on clothes or fingers, or become more intolerant of changes in routine. And they may show changes in their routines of sleep, eating, and toileting. I had one child that I had heard of. He had autism spectrum disorder and was nonverbal, and his mother had died. And after his mother had died some time later, he was noticed to be hitting his head more, his head banging more. So they tried to work him up to see if he had some cause of pain. So they checked for ear infections and sinus infections. And finally, they were admitting him to the hospital for further evaluation and MRIs under sedation. While he was in the hospital, there was a nurse that noticed that he tended to bang his head more whenever someone mentioned his mother. It was actually self-soothing behavior. And so they picked that up and then immediately discharged him, because the last thing you would want to do for a child with autism who has a real need for routines is to separate them from everyone that they know, place them in a hospital, which is a very foreign environment, and then subject them to tests and other things that make them more anxious. So I think when you have a child with intellectual or neurodevelopmental disabilities, it becomes really important to reestablish routines quickly after death has occurred. In other situations, such as after the death of a caregiver, or when there's a forced relocation to a new home or school setting, it's important that we take the time to establish new and consistent routines as quickly as possible. Explanations should, in general, be geared to the child's developmental level and the child's unique concerns and stressors. and then ensure, as I mentioned before, that children understand the basic facts as well as the core concepts of death. Now, I've been talking a lot about young children, so let me turn to the situation of older children, particularly kids that are going away for college or to start careers. Transitions to college or careers can be difficult in the best of times, but it can be particularly difficult for students who've recently experienced a significant death. This is a time when students are separated from virtually everything that's familiar and comforting: family, friends, their own bed, comfort, food. I don't know why, but both of my children describe the food that they got at college cafeterias as being the opposite of comfort food. And it really caused them a fair amount of distress for some reason. The kids are also separated from their place of worship, the park they used to go to when they wanted to calm themselves, the contemplative space in the house or in the backyard. So they instead find themselves in a foreign environment where they're expected to make friends and have fun, both of which is very difficult to do when you're grieving. And they typically lack privacy, even in their bedroom or their bathroom. There's seemingly no place to express emotions openly when they're in college, and that may make them feel both self-conscious about their grief and heighten the sense of self-isolation typically felt by grieving children. They may also be unfamiliar with the counseling and supportive services that are available on campus, such as peer-led bereavement support groups. And the academic impact of grief may make the student anxious about the new academic expectations of being in college. If a family member or friend is the one that died, children may also worry about their parents and other family members that they left behind, and may feel it's selfish to leave a home to pursue their own education or their career. And they may be reluctant to burden their parents by expressing their grief and the current struggles that they do have when they're away. So what I want to do now is provide some practical advice on how do we support grieving children related to funeral attendance, grief triggers, and academic accommodations and supports. And then I'll share with you some resources and open it up to questions. But please feel free to place any questions you have in the question and answer box or the chat box. And then Eric Rubio is going to be looking at them and we'll ask the questions as they come up. So let's start with funeral attendance. In funeral attendance, I think it's useful to invite children to participate in the funerals of those who are close to them at any age. Explain to them what's likely to happen in simple terms that they can understand and answer their questions. And I would get into practical information for them. So it might be that you say, well, in a funeral, people sometimes tell sad stories about how much they miss the person who's died. But some people may tell funny stories and use it as an opportunity to remember the funny things that the person did and to laugh about in good times that they had. So just let them know what they're likely to see. And then invite them to participate to the level that they wish. And I think it's really nice to just assign a mentor to them, somebody who is not personally grieving. So it might be a babysitter, a teacher at school. That person can just accompany the child and attend to their needs. And that way, if they want to step outside for a period of time, or they've had enough, or they just want to stand in the back of the room and hand out mass cards, but not actually even walk into the funeral home space, that's all okay. And that there's somebody that will, take care of them and guide them through that process without them feeling that they have to take care of that person. The next thing I wanted to talk about is grief trigger. Children and adults may experience a sudden increase in feelings of distress whenever there's a reminder of the person that died. And that could be anything that the person did, liked. It can be the smell of the perfume that your mother used to wear by a substitute teacher. Really, there are a lot of things that will remind children about the person that they cared about who has died. And then that can bring with it some feelings of guilt, of grief, sadness, a concern about that they might start crying. I remember interviewing a teenager, her dad had died of a brain aneurysm. She was in biology class and they were talking about the the blood system. And so at that point, as they were talking about the circulatory system, the teacher asked, does anyone know what an aneurysm is? So she raised her hand and explained what an aneurysm was. But then, the teacher asked more questions about, well, what happens when you have a brain aneurysm? And she explained, well, if the aneurysm is in the brain or another delicate organ, and it ruptures, then the person could bleed to death and die. And she just looked at me and she said, it's kind of ironic. The teacher can bring up something that means so much to you, and it may mean nothing to her. And so the issue is that her teacher didn't know that her father had died of a brain aneurysm and didn't know how difficult it was for that girl to talk about it. So then I asked, well, has that ever happened to you before? And she said, yeah, actually today, right before I came here, I was joking with my best friend, and we were talking about the fact that we had a really hard test. And I said, oh, I could get a heart attack. It was so bad. And then she said, oh, I have a brain aneurysm. And then she started shaking. And the girl said to me, it's not my friend's fault. She didn't know me when my father had died, and I never told her the reason why he died. And she's really very sweet. But the issue is that these triggers happen all the time. So you want educators to work with you on how is your child going to address those triggers in the classroom setting. First off, let them know that they do happen. And it doesn't mean you're going crazy. It just means that you're grieving. And then you can work out a safety plan for the student about how they're going to deal with these triggers when they do occur in school settings, so that the child feels more in control and less overwhelmed. So some helpful responses for these triggers include providing a safe space or location where the student can go, such as over to the school counselor's or social worker's office, or to the library or classroom across the hall, where they can go find an adult that they can talk to when they're feeling upset or want to talk, and setting procedures for the student to obtain that support in a discreet way, such as a signal or statement that doesn't draw attention, that allows the student to leave the classroom to go to the safe space or seek support. I remember one teacher worked out that the child would take a tissue from the tissue box near the doorway and then leave the room. And she knew he was having a grief trigger and knew where he was going to go and when he would come back. If children know that they can leave, if it gets really upsetting, then they're actually less likely to leave. Because if they know I can step out if I'm going to start crying, usually the grief triggers pass fairly quickly, and the child doesn't actually have to leave the room. It's that feeling of being trapped that's so overwhelming often for children. So knowing that they have that way out can be very useful. I had one teacher worked out with his student after the student's father died, that she could wear a hoodie to class, and whenever she was feeling very upset, she put the hood up. They joked that that meant she was having a hoodie moment. And when she was having a hoodie moment, he said, I'm not going to call on her. I'm going to let her participate when she's ready and to the level that she can do. And so she just put the hood down, and then you call on her. And he said that way she isn't home grieving with just her mother who's also grieving. She's getting some of the lesson that we're talking about, and I'm not making her feel uncomfortable or put under pressure. And I thought that was really a nice way that they worked it out. But I think educators need to work out something with the students who are grieving. School staff can also anticipate and minimize some likely grief triggers. For example, if you're going to do a Father's Day activity in class with the students, you should probably say something like, tomorrow we're going to write poems about your father. But some of you don't have fathers who are alive or currently living with you. You may not have even known your father. And if you want to, if you did know your dad, but he's not alive or with you anymore, you can still use your memories of him to do the exercise. Or you can just decide to pick a different man in your life who helped raise you and that you think is important to you. That way we can all do the exercise together. So that also works for children whose dad might be incarcerated or be deployed, or perhaps he never met him, or he lives far out of state and is no longer involved. And so in that way, you include all of children in your class. But I remember talking to one child, and he was an elementary school student, and he said that they were doing an exercise for Father's Day, and they were creating a bookmark that said father, and then you made up words for F and A and each of the letters of the word about your memories of your dad, and his dad was dead. So he said he didn't think he could do the exercise. So he just asked for permission and went and cried by himself in the bathroom. We really should be helping kids. All of us should be supporting kids in their grief, not leaving them to deal with it on their own. And you can anticipate other types of grief triggers that may be unique to the particular child, like the day that the person died, or the birthday of the person that died, Or maybe there was something that the child always did with that person. So maybe that was the person that used to help them with their science project and come and cheer them on in the science fair. The teacher knows that and that person is no longer alive. He or she can just say to the child, you know, I heard that you do really good science projects. Can you tell me where you're going to be in the science fair? I want to make sure to stop by and see it. I've heard so many good things about it. So you can help the child by supporting them when the person has died, by finding out what their likely triggers might be. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about academic accommodations. So it's common for students to experience at least temporary academic challenges after a death has occurred. Pre-existing learning problems can become worse and new ones can develop. And that can be because of trouble concentrating, they might have disrupted sleep, become anxious, or become preoccupied or depressed. They may have difficulty learning, remembering, or applying new concepts. It may be hard for them to get around to completing their homework because people are grieving at home, or they're staying with other people and they don't have a quiet, routine space to be in. And they may learn their material and still not be able to demonstrate that well on tests. So these learning difficulties may occur immediately after death, where they might first appear weeks or even months later. And as I mentioned, pre-existing learning challenges may become worse after someone has died, but in some situations, new ones may occur. We've even seen some situations where academics improve. Children may feel that the person they love has died because they weren't good enough as a child, and they might therefore really redouble on their work so that they can prove that they really are good, and so this doesn't happen again. And even that's problematic. So it's important for school professionals to offer academic support early on. Please don't wait until students begin demonstrating academic challenges, or worse of all, don't wait for the academic challenges to become academic failure. Teachers and family members can assist grieving students in identifying the level of academic work that feels appropriate and achievable. And I've listed some helpful accommodations here, and you might want to know them so you can discuss them with educators if your child might benefit. So one is change an assignment. So maybe the child can't really work on a long project by themselves because they're having trouble concentrating, and then maybe it would be better if they can work with a partner. But it may be for some children that they have trouble collaborating when they're grieving, and they might not want to work as a group and prefer something alone. You might take a formal research paper and turn it into an assignment that's more engaging, like an oral history project or a video that they create. But some children who are grieving feel self-conscious about their appearance and don't want to stand in front of a classroom or be videotaped. So the issue is not that there's the right type of assignment for a grieving child, it's just that what might be right for a particular child may vary, and you should speak to them. Sometimes educators should change the focus or timing of a lesson for the entire class. So for example, if there's going to be a book that the whole class is reading that describes a death in a similar manner to what the child already experienced of someone they love, then you might want to pick a different book for the class. Or if a child has a sibling that died of an overdose, they might want to postpone or change their drug abuse lesson if that's going to be discussed in it. You can also reschedule or adapt tests. Students might be exempted at first from some testing, or at least given modifications, like being able to test alone in a quiet location and have extra time. Scores might be omitted or at least weighted less if they're in determining final grades if they were obtained shortly after the death. What you need to do is find a balance between maintaining reasonable expectations so the kids can go to the next school year and do well, and balance that against providing the additional support and accommodations that they need. If you just promote children when they haven't learned basic information one grade, they may fail the next year. So it's really, you have to try and find that balance. And that can really best be done when you take into account the input of the student as well as their family. So it's useful for family members to know some of the options that teachers may consider to support their children who are grieving so they can ask for them and help coordinate it. I'm just going to end with a couple resources and then just open it up to questions. So one is the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement that I direct runs the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. And the website we use is grievingstudents.org. And there we have a range of free video-based and print materials to help support grieving students in the school. There's also a parent booklet, which is called After a Loved One Dies. It's available in both PDF format and, at least for the time being, in hard copy. We have, I think when those copies run out, we're probably going to just have PDFs of this particular booklet. Right now, it's in 4 languages, and I think there are another 6 that translations occurring. And so you can download those off of the website. There are other materials which are available in print format, and those are all free of charge, and shipping and handling is free. Then the last thing I just wanted to show you is that there was a children's show, Gordon Gibbon's Life on Normal Street, that was on Amazon Prime. I think it was geared more to middle school age children and late elementary school age. And the writers decided to have an episode where one of the main characters has a parent who dies in a car accident suddenly. And they depicted the grief that she had, but they asked me to work with them on how to do it well. And I encouraged them to not just focus on the grief, but to focus on the recovery. And so they demonstrated how parents and other adults in the community could support this child, not just for one episode, but for the rest of the series, because grief continues for the rest of their life. And so there were parts of episodes where her grief came up again, and adults provided support that often the kids really don't get. And that children's television show was excellent. I mean, it won the Screenwriters Guild Award, and it ended only because the kids were too old to pull off being middle school students. They were probably well past high school to college eventually. So it only ran for, I think, 3 or 4 seasons. But you can get a copy of these slides, and if you click on that YouTube link, it's just a brief couple-minute interview with me on the set for Gordimer Gibbons. And what I like is, I explain what we tried to accomplish in the show, or what the authors tried to accomplish, but it also links up to the actor's portrayal of it in little clips. And I think it does a very nice job of illustrating it. So the last thing that's on this is a QR code, which I'm going to encourage you to just scan it and fill out the survey. It's 4 questions. It literally will take less than a minute. I've watched people do it. And that's something that we can share both with our funder as well as with the schools, so we can figure out how to do more of this work and if it's useful to you. So at this point, I'm gonna leave this up for just another minute. But Eric, I don't know if you've gotten any questions.
I do have a couple.
Okay.
One is, how do I as a parent deal with my own grief while trying to support my child in their grief?
Okay, that's a great question. And we have the same question, by the way, for educators. How do we support grieving children during the pandemic when we're grieving ourselves? Actually, we worked with New York City schools through the pandemic, trained somewhere between 40 and 55,000 of them at the height of the pandemic, starting in April of 2020. And it's really challenging. The point is that, first off, you don't need to appear happy. You can share your grief with your child. If the child sees you cry or get choked up and then sees you be able to make dinner or go to work, that is an incredible lesson for them. They need to understand that it is safe to express your grief and that you can cope with it and you can share your coping strategies. So you don't need to do a lot. If you feel, by the way, that talking to your child is just too painful. I remember talking to my toddler to explain one of my own parents' death. And I did it once, and then the other parent made a comment that confused my kid, and I had to start over again. And after a couple of times of this, now my research was in children's conceptual understanding of death. I had taught it, I had written about it, wrote a curriculum. And I just turned to my wife and I just said, I spoke to her after I'd explained it a couple of times, and I said, this is our child and it's my parent that died. Like, it would be nice if you could help me with this. Give me a little bit of a break here. And she just said, oh, I thought you were doing a good job. I never even considered that, of course. Let me spend some time. So if you need a break, please ask for a break. Ask someone else to talk to your child. go to your school and ask them. They have school counselors and social workers and others who are getting training on how to do this. And many of them are already excellent at it. So, and you might go to your faith-based organization and ask them to speak to your child or give some advice. Turn to a relative or a friend or your pediatrician and ask, could you talk with them? You don't have to do it all yourself. You just have to make sure that somebody does it. But again, it's okay if you cry a little bit or you get choked up, because that only shows to kids that you really do care and that you're trying your best to talk about it. And remember, you can make mistakes. Kids will forgive you if they know that you love them and that you're trying hard. So I will give you an example of a mistake I made. It wasn't specifically about death, but I came home one day, a teenage daughter, well, my daughter was a teenager at the time, and she just looked a little down. So I said, what's wrong? And she looked at me and she said, I'm depressed. And I looked at her and I said, you're not depressed. She just looked at me and said, how do you know I'm not depressed? And I said, well, I guess I don't really know. Probably what I meant to say was, I wish you weren't depressed. It would make me sad to see you depressed. And she looked at me and she goes, well, it makes me sad too. But if it's going to bother you so much you don't want to talk about it, then I won't talk about it. Then I don't really see how you can help me with this. And I was like, good point. Thank you. And I looked at her and I go, tell me what happened. She got into an argument with a friend and she looked at me and she said, well, I'm not clinically depressed. And I really, really wanted to say that was what I said, but I realized that's called winning the battle and losing the war, and I just looked at her and I said, well, I'm glad that's the case. But if you were, I would really want to know about it, because yes, it would make me sad if you were depressed, but it would make me far more sad if I wasn't able to help you with it. So we both learned something today. And in the future, I hope you will tell me when something is really bothering you. And she has, she's an adult now. She actually is a marriage and family therapist. She was always very good with this. That's why when she said, I'm not clinically depressed, even though she was like a preteen, she knew that. But the issue is, kids will forgive you if they know you care, as long as you're trying. So don't worry about saying the wrong thing, making a mistake. You can always go back and apologize. But you still have to start the conversation much of the time.
So good intentions goes a long way when dealing with children.
Yes.
And being there for them. The other question, I think you kind of answered it, but just to give you a chance if you wanted to elaborate, is it wrong to grieve in front of my child?
No, it's actually wrong to hide your grief, because otherwise they will think there's something wrong with them because they're upset, and they pick up very quickly that you're not genuine. And so if you're demonstrating that what you're supposed to do is hide your feelings, then that is what children will do. And then the parents complain, like, he never talks to me about his feelings, and they've never talked about their feelings. Now, you want to talk about how you're doing in part to build your relationship and also to model effective coping. You don't want to show them everything and you don't want to tell them everything. So you wouldn't want to say, oh, I was so sad after your father died. I started drinking heavily and I considered killing myself. You don't want to share those things with your child. But you can say, I found I really was getting into arguments at work, or I wasn't being as nice at work, or sometimes I just didn't even want to talk to people. So this is what I did. And that's how I felt better. You're teaching them coping, but you can't teach coping if you pretend you never had distress. Then you can never be a model of coping. So I always realized, this when my kids, even before my kids were born, it's probably better that I tell them I'm not perfect before they figure it out, because they will figure it out. And it's really better you come clean so that they know to be honest. And I have always been very honest and open with my kids, although I don't tell them everything, but they've been very open and honest with me in return into their adulthood, sharing things with me that I think most children never share with their parents, and sometimes probably with any other adult. But they'll call me in the middle of the night if there's something that's really bad that's happened or is upsetting to them, and that they really want that support, and I want to be there for them. So it starts by you disclosing at least the fact that you're distressed. And you know what? It's not a big secret to tell someone you're grieving when someone you love has died. It's probably more weird to hide it from a child's perspective.
Okay. Good answer. Thank you. I don't have any other questions. So unless Dr. Schoenfeld, if you have anything else you wanted to share, I wanted to give a quick plug for next month with our parent series. I didn't say this at the beginning, but Dr. Schoenfeld's session today is the first in a series that we are presenting with him with Walton County Schools. And the next one will be November 14th at 6 p.m. And it'll be the same link that you accessed this one. That one will be Dr. Thomas DeMaria, and he's going to be talking about taking care of yourself and keeping calm as a parent when your child is in crisis. So looking forward to that. And Dr. Schoenfeld, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today, and look forward to hearing you again next time.
Thanks very much.